30 stories you are about to hear were not chosen at random. This is not the usual parade of debunked myths you've seen 100 times online. This is something different. These are myths that don't dwell in fifth-grade history textbooks, but rather in the very structure of our perception of reality. They masquerade as self-evident truths. They are so familiar that we no longer notice them, like wallpaper in a room we've lived in all our lives. Each revelation here is not just a correction of a fact, it's a shift in perspective. It's that moment when a picture you thought was a portrait turns out to be a landscape. When the hero becomes the villain the victim, and the greatest triumph, a carefully orchestrated spectacle. Myth number 1. Vikings wore horned helmets, the most beautiful lie. Created by opera. Imagine this. For thousands of years, this image has traveled from book to book, from painting to painting, from film to film. A mighty warrior from the north, his face weathered by icy winds, gripping the hilt of his sword, and above him, a fearsome helmet with two enormous horns jutting out, like the horns of an enraged bull. This silhouette has become an icon. It adorns beer labels, carnival costumes, novel covers, and the logos of American football teams. It is so ingrained in the collective imagination that the word Viking immediately evokes this visual image for most people. For centuries, teachers have drawn it in chalk on blackboards. Artists have recreated it in oil on canvas. Hollywood costume designers have meticulously crafted props based on this image. And no one, almost no one, has ever asked the question, where did the horns actually come from? The answer, when you finally start to search for it, is stunning in both its simplicity and absurdity. Not a single Scandinavian warrior from the Viking era, not one from the hundreds of burial sites and artifacts discovered by archaeologists, ever wore a horned helmet in battle. Not ever. It makes no physical sense. Horns get caught in branches, hinder movement, and create an additional leverage point for an opponent's strike. Any experienced fighter knows that protruding parts of a helmet constitute a vulnerability, not an adornment. Scandinavian warriors were pragmatists. Their real helmets, if they could even afford a metal one, which was rare for common fighters, were simple, cone-shaped, and featured face protection. No romance, no horns. So where did this image that captured the world come from? The answer lies in one specific year and one specific name. The year is 1876. The name is Karl Emil Doppler, a German theatrical costume designer. He created the costumes for the first production of Richard Wagner's operatic tetralogy Der Ring des Nibelungen in Bayreuth. Wagner wanted a grand spectacle, mythological monumentality. Doppler sought visual impact. He turned not to historical sources, but to his artistic intuition, and one curious detail. The fact is, horned helmets did exist in Scandinavian culture. But, and this is crucial, they were never used in battle. Archaeologists have discovered them in the peat bogs of Denmark and Sweden, dating back to the Bronze Age, around 1200 to 1000 years before our era, long before the Viking Age. They were ritual objects, ceremonial adornments for priests or special religious ceremonies. Combat weapons and liturgical items are not the same, yet Doppler blended eras, religion, and war into one striking image, and that image struck with such force that it still resonates today. The Ring of the Nibelung was a triumph. The educated world of Europe buzzed about this production. Artists, illustrators, writers, everyone copied Doppler's visual language, assuming it was historically accurate. Illustrations in books on Scandinavian mythology that emerged in the late 19th and early 20th centuries overwhelmingly reproduced this imagery. It found its way into children's encyclopedias, then into films, and later into games and comics. But what's most fascinating here isn't the mistake itself. The most compelling aspect is that the real Vikings were far more interesting than their mythological counterparts. The actual Scandinavian warriors and traders were part of a complex, multifaceted culture. They reached North America 500 years before Columbus, proven by excavations at Lonso Meadows in Newfoundland. They traded in Constantinople and served as guards for Byzantine emperors, the famous Varangian Guard. They founded Dublin. They sailed to Greenland and Iceland. Some researchers find traces of their trade routes deep in Central Asia. Their society was surprisingly intricate in terms of law. They held things, public assemblies, where disputes were settled and laws were enacted, with free women allowed to vote, a revolutionary practice for that time. Scandinavian women had the right to divorce, inherit property, and manage their own trade, privileges that most European women would lack for centuries to come. Real Vikings cared about their appearance. The Arab traveler Ibrahim ibn Yaqub, who visited the Scandinavian trading settlements, noted with surprise that these northern people combed their hair, bathed regularly, and maintained their nails. This sharply contrasted with the image of unkempt savages. The myth of horned helmets isn't just a historical mistake, it's a symptom. A symptom of our love for simple, visually striking images, even when reality is richer, more complex, and more fascinating than any imagined symbol. We glued horns onto the Vikings, and in doing so lost the real people, sailors, lawyers, traders, explorers, whose true achievements need no decorative horns to make an impression. Doppler was a great artist, but his legacy teaches us how easily a beautiful image can overshadow the truth, and how hard it is for the truth to emerge from the decorations that weigh heavier than any metal. This myth was born from our thirst for spectacle and our love for monumental images, but the next myth stems from something different, the desire to attribute qualities to genius that they never possessed. Because it's not enough for us to have great individuals. We need legends. Myth number 2. Mozart died in poverty and was buried in a common grave. There are stories we tell time and again, perfect in their tragic structure. A genius misunderstood in life, poverty, loneliness, an unmarked grave. This is a narrative we know by heart, the tragedy of Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart, who died at 35 and was buried in a common pit where the bodies of the poor in Vienna were thrown. Generation after generation, this story has been repeated as a parable of the world's cruelty toward true talent. It has been told in schools and portrayed in the Oscar-winning film Amadeus. It has become part of the cultural DNA of civilization. It is almost entirely false. Let's start with the grave. Yes, Mozart was buried in what is commonly referred to as a common grave, in German, allgemeines Grab. However, this phrase translates to a misunderstanding in popular perception. By the late 18th century in Vienna, following the reforms of Emperor Joseph II, this method of burial was the norm for most citizens, regardless of their social status. Joseph II introduced the practice of simplified burials for hygienic reasons and in an effort to combat the extravagant, costly funerals he deemed wasteful. The body was placed in a coffin with a removable bottom, lowered into a grave, opened, and raised back up for reuse. This was a governmental standard, not a sign of poverty. Both the rich and the poor, along with respected citizens, were buried this way. Individual graves marked with tombstones cost extra and were considered a privilege. The lack of a tombstone did not signify disgrace. It was standard practice of that era. Now, let's talk about poverty. Here it gets even more interesting. It is true that Mozart occasionally faced financial difficulties, but the picture of his poverty has been grossly exaggerated by later biographers, and especially by his widow, Constanza, who actively shaped his posthumous image after his death. The facts tell a different story. In the year of his death, 1791, Mozart was earning more than ever before in his life. He held the position of court chamber musician from Emperor Leopold II, with a salary of 800 florins per year. He completed work on the magic flute, which had a resounding success at the theater of Schikaneder. He was also working on the Requiem, for which he had already received a down payment. According to modern historians, his income in his final year was equivalent to the salary of a quite wealthy individual. So where did the image of a dying genius in poverty come from? Partly, it stemmed from the fact that Mozart was a person entirely incapable of managing money. He earned a lot, but he spent even more. He rented expensive apartments, hired servants, and hosted lavish dinners. In times between his successes, and such periods did occur, he borrowed money from friends, primarily from his Freemason friend Michael Pushberg, to whom he wrote dozens of plea letters. These letters have survived and become the foundation of the legend of the poor genius. But debt and poverty are not the same. A person can live on credit and still live well. Mozart did exactly that. The narrative of the genius abandoned in a ditch was actively promoted by Constanza after his death. It suited her. The widow of a great but unrecognized artist garnered much more sympathy and support than the widow of a wealthy court musician who simply couldn't manage his finances. Constanza outlived her husband by 50 years. During that time, she engaged in what we now call brand management. She sold manuscripts, organized concerts, gave interviews, and shaped the narrative. The legend of the impoverished genius was her best marketing tool. Another brick in the foundation of this myth is the movie Amadeus, released in 1984 and based on Peter Shaffer's play. In this film, Salieri is portrayed as an envious villain who poisoned Mozart. This is pure fiction. Antonio Salieri was an outstanding composer and a respected court musician. The theory of poisoning emerged years after Mozart's death and never had any historical basis. In fact, Salieri was much more successful and socially recognized during his lifetime than Mozart, and this is another fact that doesn't fit the nice myth. What killed Mozart? Debates are still ongoing. The official diagnosis of that time, throat fever, sounds vague. Modern researchers have suggested various theories: rheumatic fever with kidney complications, trichinosis from undercooked pork, even simple typhus. Most likely, it was a combination of circumstances and the exhaustion of an immune system belonging to someone who worked tirelessly and never knew how to take care of himself. The real Mozart was not a martyr of poverty. He was a brilliant, intolerable, funny, and genius man who lived too well and thought too little about the future. His tragedy is not that the world didn't appreciate him during his lifetime. The world did appreciate him. His tragedy is that he died at 35, without having realized even a small part of what he could have achieved. That is enough for a true tragedy. Why invent the narrative of a poor pit? We attribute poverty to geniuses because we enjoy this story. We like to believe that greatness and material success are incompatible. It's a convenient philosophy, especially for those who have achieved neither. But Mozart's story tells us something different. It tells us that sometimes a genius simply doesn't know how to pay their bills. And that's far less romantic, but much more human. This myth thrived on sympathy. The next one thrives on envy, and it also features a great artist. Only this time, the myth isn't about his poverty, but about his malice. Myth number 3. Nero played the fiddle while Rome burned. Summer of 64 AD. Rome is engulfed in flames, the worst fire in its history. The blaze lasted 9 days. 10 of the 14 city districts were consumed. Hundreds of thousands of people were left homeless. In those days, history tells us, the mad tyrant Nero stood on the tower of his palace, playing the violin as he indifferently watched the city he himself had set ablaze fall into ruin. This image has become one of the most enduring in history. Nero fiddled while Rome burned has turned into an idiom symbolizing the criminal indifference of power towards the suffering of the people. Politicians around the world have quoted this phrase. Journalists have used it as a benchmark for any ruler caught in inaction during a crisis. There's just one problem. It's impossible. Physically. The violin, as a musical instrument, was invented around the 16th century AD, about 1500 years after Nero's death. In the 1st century AD, violins didn't exist at all. There was no instrument, no technology for crafting its body, no bow, and no appropriate strings. Nero physically could not play something that didn't exist. So, what could he play? His favorite instrument was the kitara, a complex variation of the lyre, popular in Greco-Roman culture. Nero was indeed a passionate musician and singer, so passionate that it shocked the Roman aristocracy, who believed that public performances were only suitable for slaves and actors, not an emperor. He performed on stage. He participated in musical competitions. He made the audience sit for hours, listening to his singing. It was eccentric, It was considered shameful by Roman standards, but it was his passion. Now, where was he during the fire? According to Tacitus, the main source for this period, Nero was in Antium, about 50 kilometers from Rome when the fire broke out. When news of the disaster reached him, he immediately returned to the city. Tacitus also reports that Nero opened the field of Mars and his own gardens for the victims, organized food supplies, and reduced the price of grain. This doesn't sound like the behavior of someone indifferently playing a musical instrument. So, where did the legend come from? Its originator, or rather, its amplifier, was the biographer Suetonius, who wrote about 50 years after the events in question. Suetonius claims that Nero watched the fire from the Tower of Maecenas, admiring, according to him, the beauty of the flames, and performed the fall of Troy in theatrical costume. That sounds more poetic, even though there is no mention of a violin from Suetonius, and he himself qualifies his statements. According to him, it was said that. This is already gossip recorded a generation later. The version of arson is also highly questionable. After the fire, Nero built his grand palace and park complex, the Domus Aurea, on the burnt lands, and this provided contemporaries with grounds for accusations. However, historians remind us that Rome at that time was a wooden city, and fires occurred regularly. Building on scorched earth was standard practice. Nero was a cruel tyrant for other reasons. He executed his own mother, Agrippina. He killed his first wife, Octavia. He persecuted Christians, making them scapegoats for the fire. Real crimes surrounded him. But the legend of burning Rome and the violin is more convenient, more vivid, and more impactful. It transforms a complex, frightening, and contradictory person into a caricatured villain. Caricatures are easier to hate. Complex individuals are harder to understand. That's why we gravitate toward caricatures. The image of Nero with a violin is a creative montage born from different eras, various sources, and diverse instruments. But it works. It works because we want our villains to be simple. We want them to be easily recognizable from a distance, by their posture, the instrument in their hands, and the indifferent grin against a backdrop of flames. The real story is more complicated. There's no violin in it. There's only fire, panic, politics, and a person who was later turned into a symbol, because future generations needed a symbol. This myth is about power and its image. The next one is about science and its perception. It will show us how one night in a library can change what humanity has considered truth for 1,000 years. Myth number 4. Medieval people thought the earth was flat. Say this out loud, and you'll receive nods of agreement. Of course, in the Middle Ages, people believed the earth was flat, and Columbus was the first to dare to prove otherwise. This story is so widespread that it has become part of the cultural foundation of Western civilization. It serves as a metaphor for ignorance, religious darkness, and the so-called Dark Ages. It's repeated in schools, popular science books, and speeches by politicians discussing progress and enlightenment. And it's almost completely fabricated. Educated people in the Middle Ages were well aware that the earth was round. This was not a secret known only to a select few. It was a widely accepted, well-supported scientific consensus that was documented in textbooks, taught in universities, and debated by philosophers and theologians. The Church did not deny the spherical nature of the earth. It incorporated this knowledge into its Christian worldview. So where did the belief in the opposite come from? We need to trace back to its roots. The spherical shape of the earth was established in ancient times. Pythagoras proposed it in the 6th century BC. Aristotle, in the 4th century, provided several observational arguments for a spherical shape. Different constellations are visible in different parts of the world, and the Earth's shadow on the moon during lunar eclipses is always round. Eratosthenes, in the 3rd century BC, not only confirmed the Earth's roundness, he calculated its circumference with remarkable accuracy by measuring the difference in the length of shadows in Alexandria and Syene on the same day. His calculation was off from the actual value by about 1 to 2%. It was a triumph of rational thought. All this knowledge was not lost. It transitioned into the Middle Ages through the works of Arab scholars and Latin translations of ancient authors. Thomas Aquinas, the greatest theologian of the Middle Ages, comfortably mentioned the earth's roundness as self-evident in his writings. Dante, in the Divine Comedy, a 13th century text, built his journey based on this very spherical model of the universe. He descends through hell to the center of the round earth, then ascends through purgatory and paradise. The entire geometry of the poem works only on the premise that the earth is a sphere. Roger Bacon, a medieval scholar and monk, wrote in the 13th century about the earth's roundness as an established fact. Any student at a medieval European university would have studied the treatise On the Sphere by Johannes de Sacrobosco, the standard astronomy textbook, where the spherical shape of the earth was a fundamental axiom. What people in the Middle Ages didn't understand was the earth's size. More precisely, the question was debated. Columbus didn't convince his patrons that the earth was round. Everyone already knew that. He was arguing that the distance from Europe to Asia via the western route was short enough to be covered by the ships of his time. Here he was mistaken, and the scholars of that era, his opponents, were right. They told him, the distance is too great, and there wouldn't be enough supplies. Columbus greatly underestimated the size of the earth. He got lucky to find an unknown continent on his way. Otherwise, his expedition would have perished in the ocean. The myth of a flat earth in the Middle Ages was deliberately created in the 19th century. It was actively promoted by two individuals, American writer Washington Irving and French historian Antoine-Jean Leboeuf. In his 1828 biography of Columbus, Irving fabricated a dramatic scene where the brave explorer confronts dull medieval theologians insisting on a flat earth. This was an artistic invention, presented in a book marketed as historical. Leboeuf systematically exaggerated the religious obscurantism of the Middle Ages in his works, contrasting it with the progressive 19th century. Why was this necessary? The 19th century was marked by a sharp conflict between science and religion. Darwin had just published On the Origin of Species. The church was resisting. Those advocating for science's superiority over religion needed a historical argument. Look, whenever the church dominated minds, it plunged people into ignorance. The flat earth became the perfect symbol of that ignorance. It didn't matter that it was a fabrication. It worked as an argument. We still live in the shadow of this invention. The Middle Ages were not a time of flat earths. They were a time of something different, a time when people lived shorter lives, suffered more illnesses, and fought fiercely. Yet, during this time, they built cathedrals whose mathematics modern engineers still struggle to fully understand. They created philosophical systems of such complexity that they are still studied in universities today. They composed music that is performed even now, and they knew that the earth was round. This myth is about our need to feel smarter than our ancestors. The next one is about our need to feel superior to our allies. And it contains the story of one of the most grand diplomatic manipulations in history. Myth number 5. Winston Churchill always believed in victory and never had doubts. There is a version of Churchill known to the world, a massive silhouette with a cigar, fingers shaped in a V, a voice that sends chills down the spine, even decades later through recordings. We shall fight on the beaches, we shall fight on the landing grounds. This was a Churchill who never doubted. He knew from the very first day of the war until the very end that Britain would prevail. This Churchill was a rock against which the tides of Nazi aggression crashed. However, this version is a carefully crafted posthumous legend, supported by the memoirs of Churchill himself, written by a man who already knew how it would all end. The truth about the summer of 1940 is far darker and more human. June 1940. France has fallen. The British Expeditionary Force has miraculously evacuated from Dunkirk, without equipment, without much of their gear, and with tremendous losses. German troops stand on the shores of the English Channel. The Luftwaffe is preparing for mass bombings. All of continental Europe is under German control, or allied with it. The United States remains on the sidelines. The Soviet Union has signed a non-aggression pact with Germany. Britain is alone. At that moment, Something was happening in the office of the war prime minister that historians would only uncover decades later, when the minutes of closed cabinet meetings were declassified. Lord Halifax, the foreign secretary and one of the most influential members of the government, insisted on negotiations with Germany, using Mussolini as a mediator. Halifax was neither a coward nor a Nazi sympathizer in the simplest sense. He was a pragmatist who looked at the map and saw the deadlock. He argued that Britain could achieve an honorable peace, preserving its empire and navy. If we continue to fight and lose, we will gain nothing. In those days, Churchill was not the unshakable rock. The minutes show a man who had to repeatedly convince his colleagues, build arguments again and again, find the right words, not only for speeches to the nation, but for his own cabinet. His negotiating position with Halifax at the end of May 1940 was desperately vulnerable. Estimates suggest that the outcome of those closed discussions could have tilted in the opposite direction. How did Churchill win these internal debates? Partly through rhetoric, but partly through political maneuvering that he never described in his memoirs. He organized a meeting of the extended cabinet, not just the 5 members of the war cabinet, but 25 ministers, and delivered a speech that did not make it into the official records. He appealed not to strategy, but to honor, to instinct, to what cannot be weighed, to the image of Britain in its own eyes. The ministers erupted in applause. After that moment, Halifax's position became politically untenable, not because Churchill refuted his arguments, but because he changed the emotional climate of the room. It was not a rational victory, it was a theatrical one. Brilliant, but theatrical. Churchill won the battle of wills within his own cabinet at the end of May, and this may be the most crucial battle of the entire Second World War. Not El Alamein, not Normandy, but this stifling office in London where a few men decided whether to continue resisting. If Halifax had prevailed, history would look very different. There would be no unyielding Churchill and no icon of resilience. Instead, there would be a different myth, that of British realism. The Churchill we know today is an image crafted after victory. His memoirs, his speeches, his pose with a cigar, all created by a man aware of the final outcome. The real Churchill of 1940 was a man who was scared, who had doubts, who did not know how it would all end, yet still said no to negotiations. Not because he was certain of victory, but because he could not allow himself to think about defeat. These are two different things, and the latter is far more majestic than the former. The myth of the indomitable Churchill flatters our need for heroes without weaknesses. The real Churchill reminds us of something far more significant. Greatness is not the absence of fear. It's about what one does despite fear. This myth is about leadership and its cost. The next one is about science and its price. In this story, one man paid for the truth with his reputation, his health, and his life. Myth number 6. Ignaz Semmelweis was a madman no one listened to. The story of Ignaz Semmelweis is usually told as a tragedy of a genius ahead of his time. A Hungarian doctor working in a Vienna maternity hospital in the 19th century discovered that childbirth fever, which killed 1 in 5 women giving birth, was transmitted through doctors' hands. He instituted mandatory hand washing in chlorinated water and instantly reduced mortality in his ward from nearly 12% to less than 1%. The medical community rejected his findings. His colleagues mocked him. He went insane and died in a psychiatric hospital, unrecognized, broken. This story holds true in its basic details, but it contains one significant flaw that changes its meaning. Semmelweis didn't simply get ahead of his time. He did something that made his discovery practically intolerable for his colleagues, and this is not their fault, but his. Semmelweis was a brilliant observer but a terrible communicator. He found a correlation. The hands of doctors moving from dissection rooms to childbirth wards were transmitting something to the mothers. He knew that something was called cadaveric poison or cadaverous particles, but he couldn't explain the mechanism because the germ theory had not yet been formulated. Louis Pasteur would not articulate it for years to come. And here lies the key point. Semmelweis did not publish his data for nearly 10 years. He asked his colleagues to take his word for it without providing them with systematic evidence. When colleagues disagreed or asked for clarification, he did not respond with scientific debate, but rather with personal insults. He labeled his opponents as murderers, and open letters circulated throughout Europe. He wrote letters that today would be read as paranoid. This doesn't excuse those who dismissed his method. After all, the method worked, and they should have seen that. But it explains why intelligent people could reject his idea, because it was promoted by a man whose methods broke all norms of scientific discourse. Semmelweis died in 1865 in a psychiatric hospital from, ironically, an infection, possibly acquired during his last surgery. He was 47 years old. But here's what's often left out of the standard narrative. His method continued to work in his Vienna clinic throughout his time there. His immediate colleagues, who witnessed the results firsthand, gradually accepted the practice of hand washing. His ideas were embraced and expanded, but only after Pasteur and Lister established the scientific foundation to explain the mechanism. Semmelweis was right. His method saved lives. His tragedy is real. But it's not quite the tragedy we typically tell. It's not just genius versus ignorance. It's a story about how truth perishes when its bearer cannot or does not know how to defend it. This is a lesson for scientists, for reformers, for anyone who carries knowledge capable of changing the world. It's not enough to be right. You must be able to be heard. This myth is about science and its language. The next one focuses on war and its language. And in it, the most famous military defeat will turn out to be something different than it seems. Myth number 7. The charge of the Light Brigade at Balaclava was a suicidal blunder due to a mistake. October 25, 1854. The Valley of Balaclava in Crimea. 673 British cavalrymen on horseback march in formation straight into the fire of Russian batteries. To the left, mountains with cannons. To the right, mountains with cannons. Ahead, directly in the path of the charge, another battery. The attack lasts 20 minutes. About 150 men perish. Nearly half of the horses are killed or wounded. Poet Alfred Tennyson immortalized this charge in his poem The Charge of the Light Brigade, written a few weeks after the event. His lines, "Forward, Light Brigade, cannons to the left of them," instantly became a cultural text of Victorian Britain. The charge was depicted as a tragic heroism. Men who knew they were riding to their deaths, yet did not flinch in the face of duty. The standard version explains the disaster simply: a mix-up in orders. Lord Raglan, the commander, wanted to stop the Russians who were taking captured Turkish cannons from the heights. Captain Nolan delivered the order to Lord Lucan. Lucan misunderstood. Lord Cardigan led the brigade the wrong way. No one is to blame, a tragic mistake. 600 lives lost due to a misinterpreted order. This version is convenient, and it hides something far more unpleasant. The British Army in the Crimean War suffered not from a singular order transmission error, but from a systemic ailment that could be called aristocratic incompetence. Officer positions in the British Army were sold until 1871, literally. The rank of colonel cost several £1,000s sterling. Lord Cardigan, who commanded the Light Brigade, purchased his title. So did Lord Lucan. They were wealthy aristocrats who personally despised each other. Cardigan was married to Lucan's sister, and they were in bitter rivalry. They literally refused to speak to each other directly. Lord Raglan, the commanding general, did not see the battlefield from the positions where he issued orders. He observed from above and saw one picture. Down below, the picture was entirely different. Captain Nolan, who relayed the order, was known for his burning ambitions and disdain for caution. Reports suggest that he gestured to the brigade in the direction of the central Russian battery, rather than the one Raglan intended. The attack was not a tragic mistake of a single moment. It was a predictable result of a system where positions were bought, commanders did not communicate, orders were passed through people who had personal motives to interpret them differently, and decision-makers did not see the whole picture. The tragedy of Balaclava became a tool to glorify sacrifice and conceal incompetence. Tennyson's poem, brilliant in its rhythm, creating the effect of a cavalry charge with its very sound, turned a systemic failure into an individual feat. Their task was not to reason why. Their task was but to do and die. Precisely, their task was to die. They were not asked. And therein lies the true horror of balaclava, which Tennyson did not capture. This myth is about honor and its price in a system where honor replaced competence. The next myth revolves around another system, another era, and it too will have a place for heroism, just not the kind we usually remember. Myth number 8. Napoleon lost at Waterloo due to the military genius of Wellington. June 18, 1815. The field near the village of Waterloo in modern-day Belgium. The final act of the Napoleonic Wars. On this day, the fate of Europe was determined, and, according to the accepted narrative, it was decided by the military skill of the Duke of Wellington, who managed to hold the line until the arrival of Prussian reinforcements. Napoleon was defeated by the genius of his opponent. This is not a lie. But it's not the whole truth. First, it's essential to note that Waterloo was catastrophically close, far closer than commonly believed. Wellington himself admitted, "It was the most difficult battle I had ever fought, and I felt I was one step away from complete defeat." British and Allied forces were nearly routed several times. Had Prussian Marshal Blucher been delayed just one more hour, history would have unfolded differently. But the most interesting part is not the battle itself, but what transpired beforehand. On June 16th and 17th, 2 days before Waterloo, Napoleon split his army. Marshal Grouchy, with 30,000 soldiers, was ordered to pursue the retreating Prussians and prevent them from uniting with the British forces. This division proved to be catastrophic. Grouchy was pursuing the Prussians. He could hear the cannons of Waterloo. His generals insisted, he must go towards the sound of the cannons. He must support the emperor. Grouchy refused. He adhered strictly to the letter of the order, not its spirit. The Prussians took advantage of his pedantry and arrived at Waterloo on time. Grouchy's story is that of a man who literally followed orders at a moment when they had become outdated. It's one of the most painful tales of military inflexibility in history. The Austrian writer Stefan Zweig wrote an essay about him titled "The Starry Hour of Humanity," in which he referred to it as Grouchy's minute, the moment when an average person has the chance to change history, but fails to seize it. But Grouchy wasn't the only one who lost at Waterloo. Napoleon was unwell that day. Historical accounts and medical analyses suggest he suffered from a severe case of hemorrhoids that prevented him from writing, possibly coupled with the onset of a kidney stone disease. His usual decisiveness was disrupted. He initiated the attack several hours later than usual, waiting for the rain-soaked battlefield to dry out. This delay gave the Prussians time to reach the battleground. At Waterloo, Napoleon was defeated not just by Wellington and Blucher. He was defeated by Grouchy with his pedantry, the rain the night before, hemorrhoids at a crucial moment, and the exhaustion of an army that had undergone 100 days of continuous political and military maneuvers. Wellington was an outstanding military leader, but his genius at Waterloo lay primarily in his ability to wait, to hold the line, to remain calm. This is no less valuable a quality than brilliant maneuvering, but it's a different quality that isn't as easily turned into legend. Waterloo is not a triumph of genius over genius. It is a triumph of endurance, chance, and hemorrhoids over worn-out brilliance at the worst possible time. This myth reveals how we simplify the failures of great people, turning a chain of coincidences into inevitability. The next myth is about victories that turned out to be completely different. Myth number 9. Florence Nightingale saved the army with her kindness and lamp. Florence Nightingale, the woman with the lamp, the angel of the Crimean War. She walked through the night wards, lighting the way with her lantern, and her very presence healed the wounded. She single-handedly created modern nursing from scratch, driven by compassion and an unwavering belief in helping others. This is the almost official version. The real Florence Nightingale was a person from whom most of us would prefer to keep our distance. She was fanatically hardworking, relentless towards herself and others, politically calculating, and so obsessed with her mission that today it might be described as clinical obsession. And these traits are not character flaws, they were her true weapons. When Nightingale arrived in Scutari in 1854 with 38 nurses, the mortality rate in the military hospital was around 42%. Initially, her efforts produced no visible results. In the early months, mortality rates even increased. The standard narrative doesn't mention this. But Nightingale wasn't just a nurse, she was an exceptional statistician. She invented, or at least radically developed, a type of pie chart known as the polar area diagram, or Rose diagram, to visualize the causes of mortality. She meticulously gathered data, analyzed it, and reached a conclusion that turned her initial beliefs upside down. Most soldiers didn't die from their wounds. They died from infections caused by catastrophic sanitary conditions in the hospital. Overcrowded wards, lack of ventilation, contaminated water, sewage flowing right under the building. Treating wounds was secondary. The main issue was the environment in which the injured found themselves after bandaging. Nightingale persuaded the government to establish a sanitary commission, which, in February 1855, undertook a major renovation of the hospital, clearing the sewage system, improving ventilation, and organizing a fresh water supply. Following this, the mortality rate began to drop rapidly. By the end of the war, it was down to just over 2%. But here's the crucial point. In her own records, Nightingale initially didn't understand what had made the difference. She thought that care and nutrition were the key factors. Only after the war, upon reviewing all the statistics, did she conclude that sanitation was the main killer. This shifted her primary message from the kind sister at the bedside to sanitary conditions as the foundation of survival. The image of the woman with the lamp was created by the press, particularly by journalist William Russell from The Times, whose reports from the Crimea shocked the British public. Nightingale did indeed walk through the wards with a lamp, but it was not a symbol of compassion. It was a working tool. At night, under dim lighting, she needed to check on patients, ensuring they didn't die from dehydration or crises while the staff slept. The real Nightingale was a person who spent the last 50 years of her life largely confined to her room, supposedly due to nervous exhaustion and possibly brucellosis contracted in Crimea. From this room, she changed the sanitary standards of the British Army, reformed the civil hospital system, wrote hundreds of pages of statistical research, and created the world's first professional nursing school. All of this was done while lying in bed. The woman with the lamp was real, but the lamp was just a small part of her arsenal. Her primary weapon was a data table. This myth reveals our love for emotional symbols, which we often prefer over intellectual achievements. The next myth pertains to another form of love for symbols, those symbols that adorn our food. Myth number 10. Tomatoes have always been a staple of Italian cuisine. Sit down at a table in any Italian restaurant around the world. Pizza margherita with tomato sauce, pasta al pomodoro, bruschetta with tomatoes, caprese with tomatoes and mozzarella. It's hard to imagine Italian cuisine without tomatoes. They seem as ancient and organic to it as olive oil or pasta. This is an illusion that is only a few centuries old. Tomatoes arrived in Europe in the 16th century, brought over from the New World by Spanish conquistadors. However, for nearly 200 years, they did not make it to European dining tables. They were grown in gardens as ornamental plants. It was believed that they were poisonous, a reasonable assumption considering their relation to the nightshade family. While the leaves of the tomato plant do contain the toxic alkaloid tomatine, the fruit itself is safe to eat. In Italy, widespread culinary use of tomatoes didn't begin until the late 18th to early 19th century. The first documented Italian recipe for tomato sauce for pasta dates back to 1790. Pizza with tomato sauce became popular in Naples around the early 19th century. The famous Margherita pizza, allegedly created in honor of Queen Margherita of Savoy in 1889, took on its modern form only in the late 19th century. Before tomatoes, Italian cuisine relied on completely different acidic bases: verjuice, the sour juice of unripe grapes, or agreste, the juice of wild currants. Sauces were made with wine, vinegar, and nuts. Pasta was served with cheese, meat, and olive oil, but not with tomatoes. When you understand this, you start to grasp something broader. What we consider traditional food often emerges from a very specific historical moment, much closer to us than we realize. Traditional Italian cuisine with tomatoes is, in historical terms, a recent invention. It is less than 300 years old. The irony is that the tomato is an American plant. The culture that the world views as the essence of the Mediterranean is built on a fruit from Peru and Mexico. This is perhaps the most delicious example of cultural appropriation in the history of gastronomy. The same holds true for many other quote-untraditional foods: potatoes in Ireland, chili peppers in Thailand and India, corn in Africa. All these key elements of indigenous cuisines are of American origin. Culinary traditions shifted around new ingredients over the span of a few generations, and new traditions became ancient so quickly that no one remembered the difference. This myth speaks to tradition and its relative youth. The next one addresses another type of memory, about the memories of states and peoples, and how a single letter could change the map of the world. Myth number 11. World War I was inevitable. Europe was headed for catastrophe. A powder keg. Europe was ready to explode. War was inevitable. These metaphors have become so entrenched in the descriptions of the events leading up to August 1914 that the very question of whether the war could have been avoided seems naive. Historians, politicians, and commentators have explained World War I for generations with systemic causes, accumulated contradictions, an arms race, a system of alliances, and nationalism. The assassination in Sarajevo was merely the trigger, with a well-prepared charge behind it, destined to explode sooner or later. This version is deterministic and convenient. It removes personal responsibility. If everything was predetermined by systemic forces, then no one is specifically to blame. History was simply following its path. Recent decades of historical research, particularly Christopher Clark's book, The Sleepwalkers, published in 2012, have significantly dismantled this narrative. In July 1914, there wasn't just one point of no return. There were several moments when the war could have been halted by the decisions of specific individuals. Austria-Hungary did not want a world war. It wanted to punish Serbia without Russia's interference. Germany gave Austria-Hungary a blank check, expecting a localized conflict. Russia mobilized not because it wanted war with Germany, but because it feared losing Serbia as an ally. France was bound by an alliance with Russia, but in those critical days, the French government was aboard a ship returning from a visit to Petersburg. Britain, until the last moment, did not send a clear signal, and this ambiguity, according to several historians, allowed Germany to underestimate the consequences. Kaiser Wilhelm II attempted several times to de-escalate during the critical days of the July crisis, including his famous correspondence with his cousin, Tsar Nicholas II. The Tsar had already ordered mobilization. Wilhelm pleaded with him to stop the machinery of war. Nicholas partially halted it, but only briefly. Then, his generals explained to him that partial mobilization was technically impossible, and that you couldn't just hit pause halfway through. He reversed the reversal. This illustrates one of the key mechanisms of the tragedy. The military machines of the great powers operated on plans created years before the crisis. The German Schlieffen Plan required an immediate strike against France through Belgium. This was technically dictated by German military logistics, which left no room for alternatives. The Russian mobilization triggered an unstoppable process. Each military plan was based on the assumption that the opponent had already activated theirs. Politicians in July 14 found that the machine had slipped from their grasp. They created a system that became smarter than them. War was not inevitable. It was tragically possible. These are not the same thing. Inevitability absolves responsibility. Possibility assigns it. This myth revolves around the determinism of history and our affinity for it as a way to sidestep the question of who is to blame. The next myth addresses another type of culprit, those whom history appointed as villains, although the reality was far more complex. Myth number 12. The Aztecs greeted Cortés as a returning god. This is one of the most beautiful and persistent legends of the Conquista. Hernán Cortés arrived in Mexico in 1519. The Aztec ruler Montezuma II came out to meet him, escorting him to the capital, Tenochtitlan, and treated him with remarkable respect because he believed Cortés to be Quetzalcoatl, the feathered serpent, a fair-skinned god who, legend has it, had gone east and promised to return. This story explains everything. Why Montezuma didn't attack, why he let the Spaniards into the city, and why he ultimately allowed himself to be captured. It was a religious paralysis, a victim of a mystical coincidence. The problem is that this story is almost entirely constructed in hindsight. This was demonstrated by the Mexican historian Camal López Luján and several other researchers who examined the sources directly. The legend of Quetzalcoatl as a fair-skinned god who sailed east and promised to return is a post-conquest narrative actively developed in the early decades following the conquest. Mainly, it appeared in texts written or dictated by Aztec informants under Spanish rule, often with the involvement of Spanish monks. This is important. The story that the Aztecs mistook Cortés for a god was beneficial to both sides, but for different reasons. For the Spaniards, it legitimized the conquest. It was not violence, but the fulfillment of a religious prophecy. For some Aztec elites, it explained their defeat, transforming humiliation into a tragic fate rather than a military disaster. What do the sources closest to the event say? Letters from Cortés himself to Charles V do not mention that Montezuma thought of him as a god. In Cortés's description, Montezuma is a clever, cautious ruler who doesn't attack the newcomers due to political and military considerations. The Spaniards came with Tlaxcaltecs, longtime enemies of the Aztecs. Montezuma had practical reasons for caution that were far more substantial than religious ecstasy. The real story of the conquest of Mexico is one of brutal politics, alliances, betrayals, and epidemics. Cortés was a brilliant political manipulator, playing on the contradictions among the peoples subjugated by the Aztecs. The majority of his army consisted of indigenous allies, Tlaxcaltecs and others, who had their own grievances against Tenochtitlan. Diseases, especially smallpox, quickly decimated a significant portion of the Aztec population, faster than any Spanish weapon. The myth of the god Cortés needs to be allowed to die. It portrays the Aztecs as superstitious simpletons and obscures the true dynamics of the conquest, brutal, complex, and politically conditioned. Montezuma was not a victim of his own superstitions. He was a ruler in an impossible situation, handling it as best he could. This myth illustrates how victors rewrite the reasons for their victories. The next one is about how the defeated rewrite their defeats. Myth number 13. Hannibal could have taken Rome, but didn't due to cowardice or indecision. After the Battle of Cannae in 216 BC, one of the greatest military triumphs in history, where Hannibal Barca surrounded and almost completely annihilated a Roman army of about 80,000, his cavalry commander, Maharbal, supposedly told him, "You know how to win, Hannibal, but you don't know how to capitalize on victory." His next statement was, "In 4 days you will be dining at the Capitol." Hannibal did not march on Rome. Since then, historians, military theorists, and history enthusiasts have debated, why? Cowardice? Indecision? A fatal mistake of a genius? The answer is much more straightforward and, interestingly, more complex. Hannibal could not take Rome, not because he didn't want to, but because he lacked siege equipment. This was a fundamentally technical issue. Rome was a fortified city with tall walls. Without catapults, ballistae, or siege engines, it couldn't be stormed. The Carthaginian army in Italy had neither. They had crossed the Alps lightly, living off the land and relying on their mobility. A stationary siege required a different kind of logistics and supply. Moreover, what happens to an army after a great victory? Losses. Even at Cannae, Hannibal lost between 6,000 to 8,000 of his soldiers. The army was exhausted. They needed rest, food, and medical assistance for the wounded. Taking Rome would require an immediate continuation of the campaign in a depleted state, with no guarantees of success. But most importantly, there was his strategic calculation. Hannibal came to Italy not to physically destroy Rome. His goal was political, to persuade Rome's allies to switch sides and dismantle the Italian Confederation. If the allies saw that Rome was defeated at Cannae, they should have approached Hannibal with a peace offer. That was his true plan. The plan failed. Most allies remained loyal to Rome, which itself was a remarkable phenomenon. Rome demonstrated the ability to endure catastrophic defeats and continue the war. For Hannibal, this was information that shattered his strategic premises. His decision not to advance on Rome was not cowardice. It was an acknowledgement that the strategic game was unfolding differently than he expected. Hannibal's genius was tactical. He could win battles with breathtaking elegance. His weakness lay in strategy. He could not convert tactical victories into political outcomes. Rome, the senators who after Cannae did not flee in panic, who continued to raise armies and fight, was a system that could not be defeated by a single battle, no matter how brilliant. This is a lesson military theorists still quote today. Tactical perfection without strategic understanding is a brilliant dead end. This myth is about the limits of military genius. The next one concerns the limits of scientific genius, and how one man made a discovery that is credited to another. Myth number 14. Darwin was the first to propose evolution through natural selection. The book On the Origin of Species was published in 1859 and shook the world. Charles Darwin became the symbol of revolution in biology. His name is forever linked with the theory of evolution through natural selection. He discovered what others had not seen. Almost discovered. Almost the first. Alfred Russel Wallace, a man whose name few will remember immediately, sent a letter to Darwin from the Malay Archipelago in 1858, a year before On the Origin of Species was published, along with a manuscript. In this manuscript, the theory of natural selection is laid out, almost identical to the one that Darwin developed over 20 years but had not yet published. Darwin was in a panic. 20 years of work, carefully postponed publication, and here was a stranger from the other side of the world coming to the same conclusions on his own. He wrote to his scientist friends Lyell and Hooker for advice. They organized a joint presentation at a meeting of the Linnaean Society in 1858. Both Darwin's and Wallace's works were presented simultaneously. Following that, Darwin hastened the writing of his book, which was published the next year. Wallace discovered this only after the fact. How did he react? With remarkable generosity. He never claimed priority, referred to the theory as Darwinism, and genuinely believed that Darwin had the advantage, both in the amount of data collected and in the depth of analysis. He became one of the leading popularizers of the theory himself. But how did he arrive at his discovery? Under circumstances that were strikingly different from Darwin's study in Down. Wallace came from a humble background, making a living selling scientific specimens to museums. He worked under the most challenging conditions of a tropical expedition while suffering from malaria. In his own words, it was during a fever dream from the malaria that he conceived the idea of the mechanism through which the weak perish and the strong survive. Wallace also made other independent discoveries. He described the Wallace Line, a biogeographical boundary between the fauna of Asia and Australia that runs through the Malay Archipelago. This fundamental discovery in biogeography bears his name, one of the few instances where history has given him his due. The simultaneous discovery of one of the most fundamental theories in the history of science is no coincidence. Ideas mature when the time is ripe for them. Both Wallace and Darwin read Malthus. Both studied biological diversity in different parts of the world. Both had access to the same intellectual toolkit of the era. Darwin was a great scientist. But the theory of evolution through natural selection is one of those rare cases where history could have unfolded differently. There could have been another main character. It just so happens that this character was a gentleman. This is a myth about scientific priority and its randomness. The next one is about another kind of randomness. About those who history swept away before they could take their place. Myth number 15. The Wild West was a time of constant violence and shootouts. Cowboys, sheriffs, saloons, shootouts on dusty streets at high noon. This is one of the most enduring visual myths of Western culture. The American Wild West as a space of constant violence, where the law of the strong was the only law, and where daily shootouts were the norm. The real statistics of violence in Wild West towns from around 1860 to 1890, when this period is typically considered an era, are astonishingly moderate. Historian Robert Dye examined the records of coroners from several of the wildest towns of that era. Dodge City, often seen as the epitome of the Wild West, had an average of 1 to 2 murders per year from 1876 to 1885, just 1 or 2 a year. Ames, another legendary town, showed similar statistics. Tucson, Tombstone, the site of the famous shootout at the OK Corral, was actually a small town, where this shootout was a shocking exception, not the norm. In contrast, modern American cities with comparable populations often have murder rates that far exceed those of the Wild West. So why does this era linger in collective memory as a symbol of violence? There are a few reasons. First, the Wild West became a myth while its participants were still alive. Buffalo Bill Cody opened the Wild West show in 1883, touring the United States and Europe, featuring stage shootouts, rodeos, and Indian attacks. This was show business that created the visual language of the time. It shaped an image rather than documenting reality. Second, cheap pulp fiction about cowboys began flooding the market in the 1860s. They did what Hollywood would later do, transforming individual stories, like those of real figures Pat Garrett or Jesse James, into archetypes. Third, the real history of the Wild West is much more uncomfortable than the myth. It involves the systematic extermination of native peoples, forced relocation, and the destruction of cultures. That's not a plot for a romantic Western. It's much easier to tell stories about honest sheriffs and gun-wielding outlaws than to confront what actually happened. The Wild West was a time of expansion, opportunity, brutality, and hope all at once. But it wasn't a time of daily shootouts. That image was crafted by those who wanted to sell it. This myth highlights how the entertainment industry rewrites history. The next myth explores how wars rewrite their participants. Myth number 16. The Crusades were a war of Western religious fanaticism against peaceful Islam. The Crusades are a landscape of oversimplifications on both sides. For some, they are evidence of the inherent aggression and intolerance of the Christian world. For others, they represent the heroic defense of Western civilization. Both narratives are incomplete. Both overlook the context that makes the history much more complex. The First Crusade began in 1996, but what preceded it? Several decades earlier, the Seljuk Turks had conquered much of Anatolia, a traditionally Christian territory, and defeated the Byzantine Empire at Manzikert in 71. Jerusalem, which had been under Arab control since the 7th century, fell to the Seljuks, who were known for their harsher treatment of Christian pilgrims. This is why Byzantine Emperor Alexios I reached out for help from Pope Urban II. The Crusades were, among other things, a response to military expansion, not their cause. This does not justify the atrocities that were committed. The First Crusade was marked by pogroms against Jews in the Rhineland, long before the Crusaders set foot in the Levant. The capture of Jerusalem in 99 was accompanied by mass slaughter of civilians, including Muslims, Christians, and Jews. These were war crimes by any standard. However, the Muslim world of that time was not a monolith of moderation either. It had been preceded by centuries of active military expansion, the conquest of North Africa, the Middle East, the Iberian Peninsula, and attempts to penetrate into France. This was not aggression in a vacuum. It was a clash of two expanding civilizations. Saladin, portrayed in the Western narrative as a noble knight, was a brilliant military leader and a far-sighted politician. Yet he also waged war using religious rhetoric. His jihad against the Crusaders was both a religious and a political project, aimed at creating a unified Islamic state under his leadership. His moderation during the capture of Jerusalem in 1187 was genuine, and it was a deliberate political choice that distinguished him from the Crusaders. The Crusades were a complex phenomenon, filled with religious zeal and territorial interests, sincere faith and political calculations, atrocities and displays of chivalry, on both sides. Using them as a simple argument in modern discussions about Christian violence or Western aggression is to do with history what the Crusaders did with foreign culture. Simplify and seize. This myth speaks to our need for simple, moral narratives from the past. The next one centers on how these narratives are born at the most critical moments. Myth number 17. Marco Polo brought pasta to Europe from China. This is one of the most charming culinary legends. Venetian traveler Marco Polo, upon returning in 1295 from his famous journey to China, supposedly brought back the recipe for noodles, and that is how Europe was introduced to pasta. The legend explains the resemblance between Chinese noodles and Italian pasta and gives the story of pasta's invention a romantic hero. The problem is, it is not true. And proving it is not difficult. Pasta existed in Italy long before Marco Polo. Documentary evidence of its use in Sicily dates back to 1154, 100 years before Marco Polo was born and a century and a half before his trip to China. The Norman geographer Muhammad al-Idrisi described the production of dried pasta in Sicily, made by Arabs who had conquered the island as early as the 9th century. It was from the Arabs that Sicily acquired the technology for drying pasta, an important innovation that allowed it to be stored for months. In notarial documents from Genoa dating back to 1279, a year before Marco Polo's departure to China, there is a mention of una badisela plena de macaronis, a basket full of macaroni found among the belongings of the deceased. This serves as tangible evidence that pasta existed in northern Italy long before Marco Polo's return. Where did the legend come from? Likely from an American marketing campaign in the 1920s. The Macaroni Journal, owned by American pasta producers, published a story claiming that sailor Marco Polo brought noodles from China. It was an engaging tale meant to draw attention to the product, and it took on a life of its own. Pasta is a product that has been invented multiple times. Grain dough, rolled thin and dried or cooked, has appeared independently in various cultures: Arab, Chinese, Italian. It's one of those ideas that arise naturally when the necessary ingredients are available: grain, water, fire. This myth reflects our fascination with stories featuring a single great inventor. The next myth features another great inventor. However, his story is even more complex. Myth number 18. The Lighthouse of Alexandria illuminated the sea from 40 to 50 kilometers. The Lighthouse of Alexandria, the Pharos, was one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world and one of the tallest man-made structures of its time. Its height is estimated to have been between 100 and 130 meters. It was constructed around 280 to 270 BC during the reign of Ptolemy II and stood for about 1,400 years before it was destroyed by earthquakes. The myth surrounding it claims its light was visible from 40 to 50 kilometers away, and that it used some unique fuel or a remarkably complex mirror system, perhaps lenses or concave mirrors that focused light with incredible precision. The reality is more modest, yet still impressive. The visibility range of the lighthouse was indeed great. The height of the structure alone allowed the fire to be seen from 20 to 30 kilometers away in clear weather, quite achievable for a flame atop a building over 100 meters tall. For ancient mariners navigating along the coast, this was invaluable. However, no legendary lenses or mirrors capable of focusing light for 40 kilometers appear to have existed. Ancient optical technology did not permit the creation of a system capable of that feat. Descriptions from Arab travelers who saw the lighthouse during its later years mention a large bonfire and metallic mirrors, which is technically feasible and explains its effectiveness without the need for mystical superweapons. Another persistent legend claims that from the Pharos one could see enemy fleets long before their arrival, and that mirrors were used as a weapon to set ships ablaze. This is pure fantasy, added to the lighthouse's description by medieval Arab authors who were in awe of the ancient structure. What truly makes the Pharos remarkable is not just the legends but the fact that it was one of the first man-made lighthouses specifically designed for navigation. Its construction transformed maritime trade. The very word Pharos in Romance languages, French, Italian, Spanish, has come to mean lighthouse. This is no small legacy. The Pharos doesn't need any extraordinary weaponry to be a wonder. All it needs is to be the tallest lighthouse in the world, standing for 14 centuries. This myth illustrates our tendency to embellish greatness until the reality is obscured. The next myth concerns those who adorn their own needs with the heroism of others. Myth number 19. Pirates made captives walk the plank. Pirates are one of the most mythologized figures in Western culture. The black flag with skull and bones, a parrot on the shoulder, a wooden leg, treasure on a deserted island, and of course, two classic tortures: forcing a captive to walk the plank over sharks or hanging them from the yardarm right in the open sea. Walking the plank is one of the most persistent pirate traditions in popular consciousness, but also one of the least historically verified. Documented cases of walking the plank in historical sources from the golden age of piracy, roughly 1680 to 1730, are extremely rare. Historians have found literally only a few mentions, and even those are questionable. Real pirates of that time were pragmatists. Killing a captive meant losing a potential ransom or workforce. Far more common practices were either to take valuable prisoners hostage or to leave unwanted ones on the shore of a deserted island, what was known as marooning, and that was a real punishment. Where did the plank idea come from? Likely from literature. The first vivid description of walking the plank as a pirate punishment comes from John Nicholas's novel The Life and Adventures from the early 19th century. From there, the image spread to other literary works and eventually into Treasure Island by Stevenson, Peter Pan by Barrie, and countless Hollywood films. Real pirates were both scarier and more mundane at the same time. They operated like a commercial enterprise, taking contracts and dividing the loot according to established rules. Some pirate articles even included something like initial social insurance, compensation for losing a limb in battle. They were brutal, but methodically brutal, without theatrics. The black flag with the skull, known as the Jolly Roger, also appeared later than commonly thought. The earliest mentions date back to the early 18th century. Before that, pirates typically used a red flag, signifying no mercy, or had no specific flag at all. The true history of piracy is a story of individuals who often deserted from commercial or military ships due to brutality and meager pay, creating quasi-democratic governance structures on their vessels and staging armed rebellions against the trading system. This is a far more politically sensitive story than the light-hearted adventures with a parrot. This myth is about the romanticization of crime. The next myth is about the romanticization of science. Myth number 20. The invention of the printing press instantly launched the Enlightenment era. Johann Gutenberg, Mainz, around 1450. The first printed book. Knowledge poured into the world like water from a breached dam. The church's monopoly on information collapsed. People began to read, think, and question. The Reformation, the scientific revolution, the Enlightenment. A straight line can be drawn from Gutenberg's printing press to Voltaire. This story of the transformative technology is a favorite narrative among techno-optimists throughout the ages. It captivates with its clarity. A new technology changes everything. The reality was slower, more complex, and in some sense more troubling. In the first decades following the invention of the printing press, the most widely circulated books were not scientific treatises or free-thinking pamphlets. They were indulgences, the very ones that Luther would later criticize. The Church was the first to recognize the printing press as a tool for mass duplication of its documents. For the first 50 years of printing, most published works were religious texts, prayer books, and theological treatises. Moreover, the first 50 years after the invention of the press saw incunabula, the books of that period, largely reproducing handwritten traditions. The same fonts imitating handwriting, the same texts that had previously been copied by monks. Initially, the printing press was primarily a tool for replicating the existing rather than spreading the new. The Reformation, which began in 1517, did indeed use the printing press in a revolutionary way. Luther's theses spread across Germany at an unprecedented pace. But nearly 70 years passed between the invention of the press and the Reformation did not only give birth to the Enlightenment, it also spawned brutal religious wars, an inquisition on a new scale, and mass book burnings. The printing press spread not only knowledge, but also superstitions on an industrial scale. Pamphlets about witches were circulated just as eagerly as pamphlets about heliocentrism. The Hammer of Witches, a treatise serving as a guide for witch hunters, went through numerous reprints. The spread of literacy and the spread of paranoia went hand in hand. Technology is neutral. It amplifies what already exists, both the good and the bad. This is perhaps the most relevant lesson for our time as we once again experience a revolution in information technology and again await immediate enlightenment from it. This myth speaks to technological determinism. The next one addresses biological determinism and how one of the most famous experiments in the history of psychology turned out to be significantly less clean than we were told. Myth number 21. The Stanford prison experiment proved that power turns people into sadists. 1971, Stanford University. Psychologist Philip Zimbardo recruited students and randomly assigned them to the roles of guards and prisoners in an improvised prison. Within a few days, the guards began to mistreat the prisoners, humiliating them, depriving them of sleep, and tormenting them. The experiment had to be stopped early. The conclusion? Role defines behavior. Any normal person in a position of power over another can become a sadist. This explains Auschwitz. This explains Abu Ghraib. The Stanford prison experiment became one of the most cited studies in the history of psychology. It made its way into textbooks. Films have been made about it. It became a metaphor for explaining the evil of human nature. However, it was significantly flawed, or, to put it more gently, so methodologically compromised that drawing any conclusions about human nature based on it is impossible. In 2019, journalist Ben Blum gained access to previously classified records of the experiment. Here's what he discovered. Zimbardo actively acted as the superintendent of the prison, meaning he was not a neutral observer, but a participant setting the tone. His assistant, David Yab, provided the guards with specific instructions on how to behave cruelly. The recordings revealed, "We want the guards to feel in power. You should create a sense of boredom, fear, and arbitrariness among the prisoners." One guard, who later gave an interview, admitted that he consciously played a role, drawing inspiration from a character in the movie Cool Hand Luke. He pretended to be cruel because he thought it was expected. Another guard refused to torment the prisoners and was later practically excluded from consideration when the final report was being written. The prisoners, who began to break down, requested to go home and were denied, even though they could have left formally. One of them simulated psychosis, hoping to be released. He was not let go. This was no longer a psychological experiment. It was exploitation. Zimbardo did not publish the complete raw data. His experiment had never been replicated, at least not with the same results. Attempts at replication yielded significantly more moderate findings. This is important not just as a story of scientific misconduct. It matters because Zimbardo's evidence has been used in serious discussions about accountability for war crimes, prison systems, and the nature of power. All these discussions were partially built on data that were far less reliable than they appeared. The real question, can a role transform behavior, remains open. The answer is likely yes, under certain conditions. But this answer is much more complex than anyone will become a sadist when given power over another. This is the myth about trusting authorities in science. The next one concerns trusting authorities in medicine. Myth number 22. Open heart surgery was invented in the mid-20th century. 1953. Surgeon John Gibbon in Philadelphia performed the first successful operation using a heart-lung machine. This is often considered the birth of modern cardiac surgery, and it's true. But there's another layer to this story that usually stays hidden. 19 years before Gibbon, in 1934, the Soviet surgeon Sergei Brukhonenko conducted a demonstration at a conference in Moscow that amazed the scientists present. He showcased an isolated dog's head that reacted to stimuli. It blinked when bright light was shown on it and responded to smells. The head was connected to a device called the autojector, a mechanical pump circulating blood through it. This wasn't quite a heart-lung machine in the full sense, but it demonstrated that a mechanical pump could replace heart function. This demonstration was recorded and reported in scientific publications. However, the work of Soviet scientists in fields typically regarded as Western achievements often went unnoticed in English-language historical accounts. Cardiac surgery as we know it was developed through the efforts of researchers from various countries: Americans, British, Soviet scientists, and Norwegian Christian Barnard, technically a South African surgeon who performed the world's first heart transplant in 1967. But the stories taught in textbooks often follow a nationalistic bias. American textbooks focus on Americans, British ones on Britons. The contributions of others remain on the periphery. Behind every first in medical history is a web of predecessors, parallel researchers, and tragically forgotten pioneers. A first is always part of a continuum that began long before that point. This is a myth about nationalism in the history of science. The next one is how nationalism builds other myths. Myth number 23. The Treaty of Versailles was the main reason for Hitler's rise to power. The Treaty of Versailles, 1919. Germany is humiliated, crushed by reparations, stripped of territories. From this humiliation, Nazism arose. This is the standard explanation used by political scientists, historians, and journalists. It's simple. It's logical. It's incomplete. The Treaty of Versailles was indeed harsh. Germany lost 13% of its territory, 10% of its population, and all its overseas colonies. Article 221 blamed Germany for the war and obligated it to pay reparations, the total amount later determined to be roughly equivalent to 120 billion gold marks. But here's what's crucial. By 1933, when Hitler came to power, Germany had effectively stopped paying most of the reparations. The American Dawes Plan in 1924 restructured the debt. The young Weimar Republic experienced an economic upturn during the 20s. The Great Depression of 1929 severely undermined the German economy, far more than the Treaty of Versailles itself. Hitler came to power in 1933 amid mass unemployment, which reached 30%. This was a direct consequence of the Great Depression, a global crisis not directly tied to Versailles. Moreover, while the resentment towards Versailles was politically significant, it wasn't absolute. The Weimar Republic was functioning and had support. In the elections of 1932, the Nazis garnered about 37% of the votes, significant but not a majority. Hitler did not rise to power through a victorious election. Instead, he was placed in power through political maneuvers by President Hindenburg and his advisors, who believed they could utilize and control him. The Versailles narrative is convenient because it shifts some of the blame for Nazism onto the victors, the French and British, who supposedly mistreated Germany. This serves to soften the unique responsibility of the German political culture at the time. This is not fair. Nazism emerged from a specific mix of economic disaster, a fragile democratic culture, particular political mistakes by specific individuals, and a radical ideology that offered simple explanations for complex problems. Versailles was one element, but not the main cause. This myth illustrates how explanations of disasters are often oversimplified. The next one is about disasters that were misinterpreted from the very start. Myth number 24. The Great Wall of China was built continuously under one plan. It stretches thousands of kilometers. It's even visible from space, though that's a different myth that has already been debunked. It was constructed over centuries to protect China from northern invasions. It is a unified structure, a monumental project of Chinese civilization. It was built by the first emperor, Qin Shi Huang, and his workforce, with thousands dying with every kilometer. The real story of the Great Wall is one of chaos, contradictions, and fragmentation, which has been retrospectively transformed into a grand narrative of unity. First and foremost, the Great Wall as a unified structure appeared much later than commonly believed. The impressive sections that tourists see today, primarily in the Badaling and Mutianyu areas near Beijing, were built during the Ming Dynasty between the 14th and 17th centuries. These are relatively recent constructions. What Qin Shi Huang built in the 3rd century BC was entirely different. He wasn't building a new wall. He was connecting and extending existing fortifications of various states. These fortifications were far more modest, constructed from earth and wood, rather than stone and brick. They did not resemble the current structure or its length. Over the centuries after Qin, the wall was not only built but also dismantled, replaced, and rebuilt in different locations by various dynasties, with different materials and designs. In some dynasties, construction completely ceased. During the Mongol Yuan dynasty, no walls were built. Why would the Mongols need protection from themselves? Another detail often overlooked is that the wall frequently failed to achieve its defensive purpose. Major invasions, the Mongols and the Jurchens, did not stop at its boundaries. Sometimes they passed through, thanks to deals made with corrupt border guards. Other times, they went around it. The wall, despite its grandeur, was not an insurmountable barrier. It was a tool for controlling traffic, a display of state power, and a line for organizing defense, but not a guarantee of safety. The workforce that built the wall, or rather, its various sections at different times, did include prisoners in forced labor, especially during the Qin dynasty. Mortality rates were high. However, the figures cited in popular literature, 1 million dead or a body every meter of the wall, lack historical evidence. The Great Wall is a remarkable achievement, but it is not what it seems. It is not a single monument, not a continuous construction project, and not an impenetrable defense. Instead, it is a discrete, contradictory, multi-century response to ongoing challenges, assembled from different eras into a narrative that later became a national myth. This is a story about how nations construct their past, and it shows that the architecture of memory can be just as effective as stone masonry. This myth is about monuments and their histories. The next myth is about individuals who became monuments in their own lifetimes. Myth number 25. Raphael was a gentle, virtuous angel painter. Giorgio Vasari, an artist and biographer of the Renaissance, left us with an image of Raphael Sanzio that has become canonical, the angel painter, a man of noble character, consistently kind, gracious to all, and free from envy. Vasari wrote that Raphael's appearance was heavenly, and his character embodied all virtues. This legend persisted for centuries. It was convenient. Raphael served as a counterpoint to the unsociable genius Michelangelo and the demonic Leonardo. He was seen as proof that greatness and moral perfection could coexist. The real Raphael was a man of his time, much more grounded than the legend suggests. Let's start with his relationships with women. Raphael never married despite an official engagement to the niece of Cardinal Bibbiena, which he used to advance his career at the papal court. Instead, he maintained a long-term and passionate affair with a woman known as La Fornarina, the baker's daughter. Reports suggest her name was Margherita Ludi, and their relationship was extensive, passionate, and scandalous given his status. Several sources claim that Raphael died in 1520 from the consequences of a night spent too enthusiastically, specifically from a fever believed to have started after yet another rendezvous. He was 37 years old. His rivalry with Michelangelo was not merely competition as often portrayed. It involved real animosity. Raphael entered the Sistine Chapel while Michelangelo was still working on the ceiling to observe the unfinished frescoes. Michelangelo was furious about this intrusion. Some historians believe that it was Raphael who informed Pope Julius II about the nature of Michelangelo's work, which hastened the official opening of the Sistine Chapel before Michelangelo was ready. At the papal court, Raphael served as both an artist and an architect. He was appointed chief architect of St. Peter's Basilica after Bramante's death and acted as a kind of cultural manager, overseeing a project to document and preserve ancient monuments of Rome. This was a politically sensitive task that required skill in navigating the interests of various aristocratic families. What's angelic about him was his masterful ability to create images of such harmonious beauty that viewers felt something transcendent. This is real. But behind this mastery was a man who knew how to intrigue, to seduce, to leverage his position, all while maintaining an unstoppable productivity. He was not an angel. He was a genius with a character. And that's far more interesting. This myth speaks to our need to idealize creators. The next one addresses our tendency to demonize other figures from history. Myth number 26. Mary Magdalene was a prostitute. This is one of the longest-standing myths in Christian history. Mary Magdalene is often portrayed as a repentant sinner, a former prostitute forgiven by Jesus. This image has been reproduced in art, literature, and theological texts for almost 1,500 years. It served as the basis for sculptures by Donatello and Titian. It has become ingrained in the collective religious consciousness of Western Christianity as a given. The only problem: the New Testament says nothing of the sort. Mary Magdalene is mentioned in the Gospels several times, and in each instance, she is depicted as a prominent figure. She supported Jesus' ministry financially, was present at the crucifixion, and was the first person to see the resurrected Jesus. She was the one who informed the apostles of the resurrection. For this reason, in Orthodox tradition, she bears the title equal to the apostles and apostle to the apostles. Nowhere in the canonical Gospels is she referred to as a prostitute or a sinner. The only mention of her past states that 7 demons had been cast out of her. This would not be considered a sexual sin by the textual standards of that time. It relates to illness or a spiritual condition. So who is the sinner? The Gospels mention other women: an unnamed sinner who anointed Jesus' feet with ointment in a Pharisee's house, and Mary of Bethany, the sister of Lazarus, who also anointed his feet. These 3 women are distinct characters in different Gospel accounts. The confusion arose in 1601, when Pope Gregory I delivered a sermon that identified all 3 women with Mary Magdalene. This was not an official theological declaration. It was a sermon, but it carried immense cultural weight. From this moment on, the image of Mary Magdalene as a profligate became dominant in Western Christianity. In 1969, the Catholic Church officially recognized that this was a misconception and revised the liturgical texts. However, by that time, this image had lived for nearly 1,500 years and had deeply rooted itself in cultural consciousness. Why has this myth persisted so stubbornly? Because it was needed. The image of the repentant sinner served didactic purposes. It reinforced certain views about women and their place in religious life. It provided a convenient category for a woman who held too significant a role in the gospel text to be simply ignored. The real Mary Magdalene, according to textual evidence, was a prominent figure in early Christianity. Her image was rewritten to make her less significant. This is not just a story about one woman. It's a story about how images are constructed. This myth illustrates how religious narratives are rewritten to meet the needs of the time. The next myth shows how political narratives are reshaped according to the needs of the victors. Myth number 27. Charlemagne was the father of Europe in a cultural sense, an enlightened monarch, patron of the arts. Charlemagne holds a unique place in the pantheon of European history. The first European ruler who unified much of the Western continent under one authority. A pioneer of education, during his reign, a court academy was established, and schools were opened in monasteries. A figure under whom the Carolingian Renaissance blossomed. A patron of scholars and artists. The father of Europe. This image is part of the official European ideology. The annual Charlemagne Prize is awarded in Aachen for contributions to European unity. Recipients include Churchill, Adenauer, de Gaulle, Pope John Paul II, and Bill Clinton. Now, let's add a few details that are usually overlooked. Charlemagne was one of the most brutal conquerors of his time. His Saxon campaigns lasted 32 years, from 772 to 804, and were marked by systematic atrocities. In 782, following negotiations to suppress the uprising in Verden, he ordered the execution of 4,500 captured Saxon hostages in a single day. This mass killing is referred to in chronicles as the Massacre of Verden. The Christianization of the Saxons was carried out by force. A special edict imposed the death penalty for non-compliance with Christian rituals, for pagan worship, and for refusal to be baptized. The religious freedom that modern European values often talk about and Charlemagne's violent Christianization are difficult to reconcile. the patron of education, Charlemagne could not write himself. He learned this at an older age. According to his biographer Einhard, he practiced writing letters while keeping tablets under his pillow to train at night. It's not shameful. Many medieval rulers were illiterate. However, this creates a different image of a patron of scholarship. The Carolingian Renaissance was real. Charlemagne did gather scholars at his court, established a system of schools, and reformed Latin writing. But these actions were primarily driven by administrative considerations, the need for unification and management of a vast, diverse empire. Education served the state machinery. This doesn't make Charlemagne a villain. He was a man of his brutal and complex time. But turning him into a symbol of peaceful European integration is a projection of modern values onto a person who forged his empire through fire and sword. This myth illustrates how history selects from the past what serves the present. The next one shows that history sometimes loses its way. Myth number 28. Sherlock Holmes is the product of purely Doyle's imagination. Elementary, my dear Watson. A pipe, a violin, the fog of London. Sherlock Holmes is one of the most famous fictional characters in world literature, created by Arthur Conan Doyle in 1887. A pure fabrication, a brilliant author's invention, almost. Except for one person that most people don't know. Joseph Bell was a Scottish surgeon and professor at the University of Edinburgh Medical School. Conan Doyle was his student. Bell was a man of phenomenal deductive abilities that Conan Doyle witnessed firsthand and reproduced in his character. Bell could determine a patient's profession, where they were from, and what they had been doing recently based on their appearance, clothing, posture, calluses, and even their scent, before the patient could say a word. His demonstrations to students were legendary. He would point to a newly arrived patient and say, "You worked in a coal mine in Fife. You were recently in Manchester, and your left hand is in worse condition than you admit to the doctor." The patient would confirm in astonishment. It was watching Bell that the young Conan Doyle realized that detailed observation and logical deduction could serve not just as medical tools, but also as the foundation for captivating storytelling. When Holmes became famous, Bell acknowledged the resemblance. He and Conan Doyle corresponded. In one letter, Bell wrote, "You are Holmes himself, and you know it well." Conan Doyle replied with gratitude. He never concealed the source of his inspiration. But there's another layer to this story. Bell applied his analytical skills not just in medicine. During several high-profile criminal cases in Scotland in the 1890s, he was brought in as a consultant. His analysis of evidence and witness testimony in a poisoning case in Edinburgh helped identify the culprit. In other words, the real-life prototype of Sherlock Holmes was engaged in the very same activities that Sherlock Holmes does in the novels. Reality imitated literature, or, more precisely, literature so accurately mirrored reality that they merged. There is also a second real prototype, though it is less known. The American writer Edgar Allan Poe created Detective Auguste Dupin in 1841, 46 years before Holmes. Conan Doyle read Poe and acknowledged his influence. Dupin also employed analytical deduction and was an eccentric with exceptional intellectual abilities. Holmes stands on Dupin's shoulders. Great fictional characters are rarely created from thin air. They emerge from observations of real people, from the synthesis of existing traditions, and from the meticulous work of an imagination fueled by reality. Holmes is no exception. This myth concerns the nature of creative genius and its connection to reality. The last two myths are about the nature of human memory and its relation to what we call history. Myth number 29. The first Olympic Games were a model of peaceful competition and sportsmanship. Since their inception in 1896, the modern Olympic Games have carried a specific ideology: peace, brotherhood, and fair competition. Their founder, Baron Pierre de Coubertin, was inspired by the image of the ancient Greek Olympic Games as a time of sacred truce when city-states would lay down their arms for the sake of athletic competition. The ideal picture? Athletes from warring city-states competing under the same rules, where war gives way to sport. This image is highly romanticized. Let's start with the Olympic truce, the Ekacheria. It indeed existed, but it did not mean a complete cessation of wars. It guaranteed the safety of the routes to Olympia and the right for athletes and pilgrims to travel there and back safely. Wars continued during this time. The Spartans once broke the truce and were fined 200,000 drachmas. They paid the fine and continued fighting. Participation in the Olympic Games was strictly limited. Only free men who spoke Greek were allowed to compete. Women were not only barred from participating, but they were also forbidden to attend the Games under the threat of death. At least, that's what some sources claim, although the reality of this ban is debated. Slaves were not participants. Non-Greeks were also excluded. The athletic competition was much harsher than its idealized image. Pancratium, one of the main events, was a brutal combat sport where almost anything was allowed, except biting and gouging eyes. Participants sometimes died. Those who choked their opponents, nonetheless, were declared winners. Winning at the Olympic Games carried enormous political and commercial significance. The victor returned home as a hero. Statues could be erected in their honor, and their city would award them generous monetary prizes. Professionalism, which Coubertin fought against in the modern Olympic movement, was the norm in antiquity. Athletes trained professionally and were sponsored by their cities. The Games did not end because the Olympic Brotherhood faded. They were abolished in the late 4th century AD by Emperor Theodosius I as a pagan cult. The Games were inseparable from religious worship of Zeus. This was an administrative religious decision, not a symbol of spiritual decline. Coubertin created the modern Olympics, inspired by the myth of ancient Olympia, and that myth served him well. But it was just a myth. The actual ancient games were harsher, politically charged, and far less universal than their modern representation. This doesn't make the modern Olympics any less valuable. It reminds us that sometimes a beautiful idea is more important than historical accuracy. Coubertin didn't create a restoration. He created a new tradition, inspired by an idealized image. This is fair as long as we understand it. This myth speaks to our need for inspiring precedents for our modern ideas. The ultimate myth is about our quest for something greater. Myth number 30. Alchemists were mad charlatans engaging in meaningless experiments. Alchemists, figures that evoke a condescending smile from the educated modern individual. People who spent their lives searching for the philosopher's stone and the elixir of life, two things that are essentially impossible. They were the forerunners of chemistry, if you will, but only insofar as science sometimes arises from misconceptions. Their work was fundamentally fruitless. Or was it? Let's begin by acknowledging that alchemy was not a marginal activity but an intellectual mainstream of its time. It was practiced by some of the brightest minds of the Middle Ages and the Renaissance. Roger Bacon. Paracelsus, essentially the founder of toxicology. Jan Baptista van Helmont, a pioneer of gas chemistry who discovered carbon dioxide and other gases. Robert Boyle, one of the founders of modern chemistry who formulated the law of ideal gases, was a practicing alchemist. And finally, the most revealing name, Isaac Newton. Newton, the symbol of the scientific revolution, the creator of classical mechanics, the author of Mathematical Principles of Natural Philosophy, was one of the most serious practical alchemists of his time. He wrote over 1 million words on alchemy, more than on physics and mathematics combined. His alchemical manuscripts, deliberately unpublished during his lifetime, are preserved in Cambridge and Jerusalem. Historian Keynes, who studied them in 1936, wrote, "Newton was not the first scientist of the Age of Reason. He was the last great magician." Newton sought the philosopher's stone. He experimented with mercury for decades, which likely slowly poisoned him and influenced his behavior in his later years. He corresponded with alchemists all over Europe. He studied the Bible, searching for encrypted clues to alchemical knowledge. How does this relate to the image of the rational Newton? This is the real Newton, a man whose consciousness held new science and ancient wisdom side by side, without viewing them as contradictory. For Newton, alchemy was not superstition, but another method of exploring nature. This helps us understand something important about the scientific revolution as a whole. It was not a complete break from the past. It grew from the same roots, from natural philosophy, from alchemy, from astrology. The line between science and pseudoscience was drawn after the fact, only after some methods proved fruitful while others did not. Moreover, alchemists made real discoveries. Paracelsus used mercury to treat syphilis, toxic but effective in small doses. Alchemical experiments with various substances led to the discovery of phosphorus, antimony, and bismuth. The methods of distillation, melting, and crystallization developed by alchemists directly transitioned into early chemistry. Alchemy was not meaningless. It was a question asked wrongly, but using real methods that yielded genuine side results. This isn't madness. This is science in the making. Visualize Newton in his laboratory, surrounded by flasks of mercury, deciphering Jewish mystical texts while noting the results of metal melting experiments. Next to him on the table are manuscripts of his Principia. He sees no contradiction. For him, it is a singular pursuit, to understand the laws governing the world. He searches everywhere. Some of his inquiries lead to celestial mechanics. Others lead to mercury vapors and infected blood. He errs in alchemy. But his mistakes are those of a seeker. That's more honest than the certainty of one who does not seek. 30 stories, 30 moments when the familiar map of reality turned out to be drawn on the back of another map, one that no one bothered to flip over. What connects all these revelations? Not malice or mass ignorance. They are united by something more human, the desire to simplify. The desire for a clear image, a hero without weaknesses, a villain without justifications, an inventor without predecessors, an era without nuances. We create myths not out of spite. We create them from a need for order. But truth is ordered differently. It is arranged according to what was, not what is, convenient for us. And as we approach it, the world does not become worse. It becomes richer. It becomes more interesting. It becomes more ours, because we start to see people instead of symbols. The real Newton, with his alchemy, is closer to us than the sculpted Newton of the scientific revolution. The real Churchill, who felt fear, resonates more than the unshakable, iconic figure. The real Florence Nightingale, with her data tables, inspires just as much as the woman with the lamp. History is not a museum of wax figures. It is a living substance, and the more honestly we engage with it, the more it gives back. The archive does not close. It continues to work.